Welcome once again. François Hollande is a man with a huge balancing act to get right. On the one hand, he has elected as President of France on a socialist ticket with a mandate to maintain certain economic principles. But here's the problem. He's got to make some dramatic changes if he is going to promote economic growth. Those pro-business reforms were supposed to be voted on in Parliament, but instead of a vote today, his government decided to force the reforms through via decree. Why? Well, it seemed that the rebellious left-wing members of his own party might actually refuse to support his reforms. We'll be asking what all this says about the country's reform programme in a moment. But first, Hugh Schofield is in Paris and brings us up to date with today's dramatic events.
A frenetic day at the French National Assembly. Just a couple of hours before voting on its flagship new business law, the socialist government decided the numbers were too close to call. Left-wing rebels could bring it down. So Prime Minister Manuel Valls took the controversial step to push the law through by decree.
Aucun risque. Je ne prendrai pas la responsabilité.
Ignoring jeers from the opposition, he said that though the law probably did have a majority, it was too risky to put to a vote a measure which was of such vital importance to the French economy. Watching was Economy Minister Emmanuel Macron, who spent months drafting the law and bringing it through the Assembly. Broadly pro-business and inspiration, it contains more than 200 articles. One will allow more trading on Sundays. Others will simplify France's unwieldy labour code, taking some of the risk away from employers in disputes with unions. There's been opposition, not just from the left, but also from members of many professions, fearful of deregulation. These are lawyers who took to the streets recently. In Parliament, the government's enemies on right and left are delighted that it's been forced to act by decree. For them, it's an admission of weakness.
This government doesn't have a majority anymore, and it's been forced to pass by the 49-3 decree. The French Socialist Party will end up like the PASOK Greek Socialist Party with 5% of the votes. They're sending the country into an economic crisis, they're not resolving any of the problems, and the only people they're answering to is Brussels.
President Hollande will get his bill, but by threat rather than by persuasion, and the momentum for further economic reform is badly dented. Hugh Schofield, BBC News, Paris.
Well, why are the French doing this now, or more particularly Monsieur Hollande? Why is he doing it now? And where might this all take us? With me now, as you can see, in Cambridge is Olivier Tonneau. He's a lecturer in modern language at Homerton College at the University of Cambridge. And here on my right is Yannick, manager, but also specialised in European policies at École Nationale d'Administration. There we go. Okay, let's get that over and done with. Yannick, yes. You know, he's left himself quite exposed. He now has a confidence vote. Yes. Why do this now? Do you think it is in any way related to the discussions that Greece, for example, is having?
Yeah, I think it's related to Europe. You have to think that next week the European Commission will have to decide to assign a fine to France or not, because they didn't fulfill the commitment in terms of reducing the deficit. So the European situation is problematic. They have to show to the European Commission and to Germany that they are willing to reform, not like Greece, but that France will continue to reform. So it's not luxury. On top of that, France is not growing almost since 3 years. Last week we had the number of the growth of the country was up 0.1% for the last quarter versus up 0.7% in Germany. So France right now is doing nothing. They need to kickstart the economy.
Olivier, we come to you that you're by no means convinced that reform will anyway deliver economic growth, but perhaps you could explain to us why the French are so opposed to it.
Oh, I think the French are opposed. I don't think French are opposed to reform per se. For instance, if you look at the last major reform introduced by a socialist government, it was a reduction of the weekly working hours from 39 hours to 35, and that was very enthusiastically endorsed. So I'm guessing it just depends what reforms, if you like. And in this case, you know, you asked why is Hollande doing this, but Hollande did nothing in this case. It is actually his opposition who forced him into this move. And I think in France, not only do we have historically certain reluctance towards the liberal agenda of flexibilizing the work market and so on. But of course, over the last years, the consensus, even among economists actually, that these reforms are pointless, will not help to grow the economy, and have actually led it to deflation, has become more and more prevalent. So it's quite logical that at this point Hollande would meet opposition. Note that it's not from the French, from the population, if you like. It is a position from the parliamentaries, from parliamentaries who actually stood by Hollande, by his presidential program. They never agreed with the liberal reforms he implemented originally.
Yannick, would you agree that this is a problem, if you choose to see it that way, of the political classes? Yes. And, you know, this list of reforms have been described as rather eclectic, haven't they?
It's a very eclectic list of 200 measures in order to try to boost growth or to open shop on Sunday and so on. If you look at what the public is thinking, there were a poll back at the end of January, and more than 60% of the population, of the voter, were in favor of this text. So what we have, it's a difference between the population and the political class. In fact, François Hollande has the majority of 2012, when in fact now he's trying to push a different type of reform. So it's a very, very strange position. And on top of that, obviously the opposition will make no favor to François Hollande if they can win a vote, if they can make his position more difficult. But all in all, we have to question right now if François Hollande can have a broad enough majority at the National Assembly until 2017. It's far from being obvious now.
Olivier, one of the things I was doing a programme on exactly this subject, of the difference in economic approach between France and Germany. I was doing this at the end of last year. And one of the things that sort of emerged is that many politicians have gone to very similar schools, they have a very similar social background, and there isn't really much new thinking coming in. Whichever leaning you have, there's nothing new coming here.
That's right, and not completely so, I think, because you have a very, very broad diversity of thoughts in academic circles, for instance, in France. And indeed, you know, you can see that in the English-speaking world today, there is a growing anti-austerity camp, a sort of rebirth of orthodox in the US and in the UK. In France, that has always been very, very strong. What is true is that for a while, French politicians were very detached, actually, from scholars. They were only working through these circles of administration and financial experts and so on, rather than academics. And now, actually, ever since 2-3 years, this contact has, I think, has been restored, so that a lot of the people who actually oppose the Macron law today are working quite closely with left-wing economists and so on. So you see, it is not simply, I think, a political sort of inner struggle thing. It is indeed perhaps the emergence on the political scene of different ways of thinking.
Yannick, if France and Germany are unable to stand side by side, this raises questions over how tough they could get with other countries within the Eurozone. Yes,
I think today there must be an alarm bell in Germany, in Berlin and in Brussels, because it will be very difficult to ask Greece to continue the promised reform, to make sure that if, you know, Podemos, for example, there will be election in Spain towards the end of the year. If Podemos get a majority, we will have again the same kind of discussion. If you can't count on France, on core Eurozone, in order to deliver reform and to implement what they're supposed to, what they're supposed to do with the Commission, I think it will be very, very difficult to have some cohesion within the Eurozone.
Yannick and Olivier, thank you very much indeed for a fascinating discussion.